Hello everyone, I'm Barbara Law and I'm here with my husband Terry Law, and for this month of May he's been bringing a series called The Men and Women of Hope, looking at various people in the Bible who, facing great difficulties, dare to put their hope in God, had a confident expectation in God's goodness. Terry began by looking at the figure of Noah, who after 375 days of sheltering in place, hoped in God's deliverance and sent out a dove to find out if there was dry land. And Terry followed that with a study of the character of Jacob, that scamp of a patriarch, who the night before he was to meet the brother that he had deceived and treated really badly, wrestled all night with an angel in hopes that God would also deliver him from the just deserts that he was fearing he was about to meet the following day. And then we took a look at the figure of Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who believed in God and put her hope in him that he would save her, an outcast among the outcasts, from the planned destruction of Jericho. And not only did he save her, of course, but we know that she became part of the genealogy of Jesus. And then looked at Moses, who dared to hope in God that he could actually change God's mind when God told him he would destroy this apostate Israelite nation. And Moses did indeed change God's mind. So today Terry wants to bring another story. Today the story of Hannah and her young son Samuel. Terry?
What a great story this is in the Bible. Hannah was childless as a wife of her husband Elkanah. She wanted children, and she came to the temple in Shiloh in Israel, crying out to God and asking God to give her a child. And Eli, the priest, saw her at the gate of the temple and thought she was drunk. Her mouth was moving, but she wasn't saying anything, and he rebuked her. And she said, "No, I'm here because I want to have a son. I want God to bless me with progeny, etc." And Eli said, and prayed a blessing over her and prayed that God would help her. Well, she went away and with faith in her heart and with great hope that God would answer. And thank God, that's where our hope is. Our hope is in the Lord. And she prayed that God would give her that son, and that son came. Before a year was over, she had born a son, and she had promised the Lord that she would give her son Samuel back to the Lord to worship and serve God, and with Eli the priest and Hophni and Phinehas in the temple. So anyway, Samuel was brought to the house of the Lord by his mother Hannah. And Samuel was pressed into service for the Lord. He was working as a kind of an aide-de-camp for Eli there. And one night Samuel was praying, wasn't even praying. He was just had laid down to go to sleep. And a voice called out, said, "Samuel." And he thought it was Eli calling him. He got up in a hurry and walked over to Eli's bedroom and said, "Here I am." And Eli said, I didn't call you. Go back and lie down again. So Samuel went back. Second time, "Samuel," a voice comes, and he runs to Eli. Eli said, "It wasn't me, Samuel." He said, "Go back and lie down one more time, but if this voice comes back, say to the voice, 'I'm your servant, and I want to do what you say.'" So one more time it happened, and the voice came, and Samuel answered and began a prophetic conversation with God himself. And God outlined the fact that he wanted him to be a priest in the land of Israel, and he had great impact in the future. He anointed Saul the king. He anointed David to take over from Saul. And Samuel was used in a great way. But I've often thought of that story of a little boy laying in bed, and he hears his voice being called. He thought it was Eli. In his mind, whatever he heard, it was sounding like Eli had talked to him during the day. But God had chosen to talk to a child. Now, at that point, Samuel was probably about 3 or 4 years of age. Here is a fact of God, and the fact that God chooses to talk to children. And I would say to those of you listening to me today, I think God is talking to a lot more of us than we realize, and has probably talked to you from the time that you were a child up until the present day. But it's important that we get ourselves ready to hear what God has to say. And I would say to you very clearly that you can hope to hear God's voice. You can hope to hear his direction in your life, not necessarily to send you as a missionary to the end of the world, but you can ask God to involve himself in your life every day, and you can listen for his voice. And that hope is something very important. I remember as a young boy myself, 14 years of age, taken to a camp meeting, and I heard this camp evangelist preach on missions. I was a young fella. I didn't know a whole lot. I was kind of a wild hare. And that night in the meeting, God spoke to me. And I was unable to leave the meeting that night. And the camp evangelist had left his Bible on the pulpit in an old-fashioned Canadian camp meeting on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. And I knew that God was saying something to me, and he came back in to get his Bible, sensed that I was there, couldn't see me in the dark, walked over, put his hand on my shoulder and on my head and started to pray. And he said, "Young man, God has called you to the nations. I see you standing before tens of thousands of people halfway around the world." Now, to me, as a boy, did God talk? I didn't know what was going on. I was totally unsuspecting in terms of the important spiritual business that was being conducted that night. But later on, everything that man said about my life came to pass. God had called me to nations. He saw a vision as he laid his hand and prayed for me. He saw me working in nations around the world. And so I'm here to say something very important. We can hope to hear the voice of God. And I would ask each one of you, in your own life and in your walk with the Lord, God doesn't shout at everyone in stentorian voices. He talks quietly. Usually it's a still small voice, but we hear it inside. Sometimes that's all we hear is that still small voice. But the fact that God is talking to us is supremely important in your life and mine. And I'll tell you, when you hear him, you listen to him, you do what he says, it's going to change the future of what your relationship is with God. But the hope I want to leave with you today in this Bible character is that God talks to people. The Bible is full of instances that illustrate that. And my prayer would be that as you listen to this, that God would talk to you today in the quietness of your own life and your own heart and tell you that he loves you, tell you that he's got some wonderful plans for you, and encourage you to just quiet yourself sometimes, be alone with God, and listen to what he's saying. Because he's going to say some very important things. Let's hope in the Lord. God bless you.